Hello, Sona. Happy 4th of July.
Happy 4th of July.
Any big plans to celebrate?
No big plans. There's a new kind of park recreation area that opened downtown, so we might go check that out, but nothing big. The fireworks are on the other side of the city this year. Usually we have a great spot for the fireworks just in my neighborhood, but not this year.
Does it go back and forth every year? How does that work?
I feel like for a while they alternated it every
Yeah.
year, but
hmm
now apparently this is the first time in 10 years that they have had it on the west side.
Wow.
So I've been spoiled. But I enjoyed it while it lasted.
Yeah, we used to live on the riverside of Jersey, and we always obviously have a great view right from there. But yeah, then it would alternate. At that time, I think alternated back to the other side, back and forth. But interesting that it's been this long period of time. Also, about 10 years since I've lived around there, so I haven't been privy.
You didn't miss it.
We're going to go up to Eagle Rock and see them from up there, which is what I used to do when I was younger. Okay, so because of audio issues and also just scheduling issues, I never published our initial conversation where we covered the first two episodes of Presumed Innocent, but we teased it here on the podcast multiple times as we've been talking about it, that we really loved the first two episodes of the show.
Loved it.
Let's have a really short overview of how much you're liking the show. And maybe we do say how we felt about the first two episodes and then how maybe we feel in general, but some general opinions before we get into spoilers, because I think the most of this conversation, we really need to get into spoilers and talk about what happened in episodes 3, 4, and 5. But I'd say for episodes 1 and 2, I think anybody can watch episode 1, by the way. Apple TV always gives you the first 1 or 2 episodes for anybody to watch. And I would say if anybody wants to sample it, I really highly recommend how absolutely terrific episode 1 of this show is, and episode 2 as well. But really, episode 1, just a total knockout. Just to set it up a little bit, this obviously is, maybe not obviously, but this was a huge bestseller. Maybe most people aren't aware of this. Back in the 80s, late 80s, Scott Turow was an actual lawyer. There was all this buzz about like, oh, this was such a realistic examination of the legal process. This is someone who had been primarily a lawyer until this moment, and then became, of course, a huge successful author. I don't think he writes anymore. If he does, not to any kind of acclaim. But there was like a whole string of big hits he had coming off of this massive first book. And of course, 2 or 3 years, maybe 3 years after the book's huge success, this was in the time of having these kind of adult, sexy dramas, whether they were explicitly erotic thrillers or even just mature courtroom dramas like The Verdict, for example. A great film, by the way, The Verdict, with Paul Newman from about a decade earlier than this film adaptation. So there was a whole genre of courtroom dramas. Of course, people are probably familiar with that. Now it's really transitioned to TV. You have adaptations of John Grisham novels, but this used to be a big deal, right? Like you would have a big courtroom drama. It would be a blockbuster, right? Unheard of nowadays to imagine going to see a movie that would make $150 million that really just appeals to an older audience. I guess that audience has just transitioned to TV, and that's why we have this as a TV series, I assume. So this was the heyday of that time, and it was adapted into a very popular film starring Harrison Ford, of all people, in this Jake Gyllenhaal role. At the time, that was scandalous because he was this heroic character in most of his famous roles, and then he's playing this very shady character here, the rusty, savage Alan J. Pakula, by the way. I have a recommendation related to Alan J. Pakula, which I'll make to you in a little bit, who made a lot of thrillers, by the way, including The Pelican Brief, but had been making movies for decades at that point. A New Yorker, by the way, who died on a traffic accident just a few years ago. And of course, this film, this book has a very famous twist. If you've read it, everybody knows it. Or one of those films that maybe, and books as well, that people told them you have to see it, you won't see the twist coming, etc. So all that context to say, if you're not familiar with it, don't read spoilers. I don't know if this is going to be a faithful adaptation of the original ending or if they're going to modify it. Importantly, the critics have seen every episode except for the finale, which of course leaves things open. We discussed this in our unpublished conversation. A smart thing to keep everybody guessing right until the end. Now, decades later, we have this new adaptation. I was very skeptical, especially thinking they're probably going to keep the same ending. Do I even care about seeing this? And the greatest compliment I made, I think I texted this to you when I first watched those first 2 episodes, is that even if the ending is exactly the same, I would still recommend this show because I found the execution of it so compelling and the psychology of the characters. And a spoiler from my general opinion, the show has drifted a little bit into the soapy territory I was worried about, although I'm still compelled by it, but not as much as those first two episodes. With all that context out of the way, Sona, your general opinion of those first two episodes before we get into spoilers.
I really love them. I thought they were really compelling. I am someone who, back in the day, pretty much contemporaneously, I think, with these events happening, I read the book close to when it came out, and I watched the movie close to when it came out. I probably didn't see the movie in the theater. I probably rented it at Blockbuster Video, or maybe it was on HBO. Knowing the story, knowing how it ends, I still found these first two episodes really great. And I think, given it's been a long time since I've been familiar with this material, I did feel like they were trying to do some new things with these characters. I liked the way the role of the wife, of Rusty's wife, is being developed. They're giving her a lot more depth than she had, to my recollection, in the book and the movie. I thought it was interesting that they decided to make this an interracial relationship. And I think they've touched on that a little bit. I'm not sure if it's really going to be more of a casting choice and a non-issue, or something that actually has some implication to the way this story develops. I personally would not necessarily be disappointed if this has the same ending as it did in the book and the movie. I thought it was a good ending, a solid ending. But I do think it's interesting that they are, again, to my recollection, developing some additional possible red herrings here.
Yeah, I agree. There's almost like one red herring or a suspect at least per episode, practically.
Mm-hmm.
There are some times where I feel in some of these TV thrillers in general, there's oftentimes a lot of red herrings, and then maybe Big Little Lies is a good example of this, but there's a lot of directions you think the story might go into, and then they don't pay off, or they drag things out and then they only have one reveal at the end. This is a very much a television show. It feels like a television show. David E. Kelley, by the way, writing all these scripts, and someone who's written many legally adjacent scripts over his lifetime, from LA Law through what other shows has he done? The Practice, so many, right? Ally McBeal. He used to be a lawyer also, just like Scott Turow, by the way. He also has made a lot of TV, a lot of network TV, right? Where you have to churn out 20 episodes in a season.
Mm-hmm.
And to that extent, I think the show's been successful at that. And part of the reason I keep watching it is, even as I think the quality has maybe stepped down a bit, that it has that very television-ish structure where it sets up a hook, but then it develops it immediately. So it's not a frustration of just throwing more red herrings out there and really losing the attention of the audience potentially. The red herring or the suspect that's introduced as a hook at the end of one episode is immediately followed up with in the second episode, usually discounted as a suspect, but not fully. And then also it uses it as a springboard for the development of the story in the next episode. So it is very traditional procedural TV, but well done, I think, for the most part.
I agree with that, although I do wonder if maybe, how many episodes are there total here?
We only have 3 more. Yeah.
Okay. And we see, so 8 altogether. I wonder if maybe this is just a couple of episodes too long. Do you feel like the pacing is a little bit erratic? Maybe it's on purpose, but personally, I have not enjoyed the pacing.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Even if it is on purpose, it's not really working for me.
Oh, I completely agree. And as a matter of fact, I texted you that I think this show may have jumped the shark this week. Or it's in the process.
I wouldn't go that far.
I should say it's in the process of jumping the shark, possibly. But what I would say is I texted you that in the middle of my watching of the episode.
Okay.
What I would say is the button on the episode, and we'll get to it, is excellent. And much more importantly, it does make me much more vested in the show, because at this point, I don't know if you call this a spoiler or not, but at episode 5, for anybody who's maybe past episodes 1 and 2 and is curious, the very end of episode 5, the court proceedings are about to begin. And I find I feel that this is really what I've been waiting for the show to get to. So to your point, they probably should have gotten here sooner, but I feel like the last 3 episodes are now going to start honing a lot of the things that we've been throwing up in the air over the course of the last 2 episodes at least. I think episode 3 and 5 are the weakest, in my opinion. Episode 4 was very entertaining for me. I thought it was really tightened things up after a very messy episode 3. But I really enjoyed episode 4, maybe my favorite episode of the season. But then this past episode, we'll get to it. All right. So that's the introductory opinion of it. Still very entertaining. We'll come back, by the way, to anybody who tunes out at this point. We'll come back for our final verdict when we get to the end of the season. Definitely stay tuned for those follow-up conversations. Let's get into some of the spoilers here of the show itself. In episode one, I forgot to bring this up when we had that conversation we never published, but I really do find it an interesting table setting for episode 1, where we open with Jake Gyllenhaal talking to us as a jury and basically saying, if I convince you that there's a possibility that this person committed the crime, I've failed at my job. If I convince you that you're almost certain that this person committed the crime, but you're not certain, then I have still failed my burden of proof.
Yeah, and, not a very realistic opening for a prosecutor, by the way.
I did have that question for you. Exactly. Like, in your experience, how do you feel about that?
I think they're going to take a verdict in their favor, regardless of whether it's sound or not. I think any lawyer would, not just a prosecutor. So I don't know why you would emphasize the high standard that you're held to as a prosecutor.
I did want to circle all the way back to that at this particular moment because of where we end up in episode 5 specifically. I'll save it for when we get there.
Okay.
This is an incredible cast, by the way. We have Bill Camp as his boss from The Night Of. Highly recommended if anyone has not seen that. An exceptional and honestly not the type of thriller that this film is. It's almost like it almost is the opposite of this type of thriller, to be honest with you. And that's why I love it so much.
Yeah.
It is interested in all the things that do not appear in these type of shows. And anyway, just absolutely brilliant. It's on HBO, easily accessible, incredible performances all around there. But that is a better show than this one. I hate to say it, but if you're watching this and enjoying it, do check out The Night Of if you haven't already. Ruth Negga is playing Jake Gyllenhaal's wife here, Barbara. One recommendation I have for her briefly is a film on Netflix called Passing, which is based on a short story from the 50s or 60s, I forget, and basically about these 2 friends who grew up together, African-American women, and that they are, Tessa Thompson plays the other one, and how they are passing for white. And it's all about this tenuous moment in time where you could potentially pass for white. One of the characters is married to Alexander Skarsgård, who's incredibly racist and not aware that his wife is actually black. So it's actually a very tense interaction there in the middle of the film. It had some Academy Award nominations, but it came out during the COVID years. So probably forgotten, beautifully shot in black and white. Yeah, check that out. She's excellent in that. I think she got some award recognition for that film. She's been around for a while, giving great performances. This is one of her highest profile performances, I believe.
Yeah, I think she's great here. I think especially in the first few episodes, she is doing a lot without saying a lot. And I really liked that. I think this wife is a very conflicted character, and that's coming through very clearly.
And it's a very tricky performance she has to pull off, as you mentioned. They put a lot on her, basically, too. And we'll get into it as we break down the plot. Peter Sarsgaard here is playing Tommy Mottola, who's incredibly detestable in this show. By the way, Jake Gyllenhaal's...
Hey,
yes,
Tommy
yes.
Tommy Mottola is a music producer.
Yes, Mariah Carey's ex, right?
Yes.
Tommy Molto. By the way, Jake Gyllenhaal's real-life brother-in-law, so another family connection here. Mm-hmm. And then Bill Camp's wife, who I forget the actress's name, but she's been in a whole bunch of things. And excellent
great.
here.
I love her in this.
She's terrific in this also. Who else is here giving a great performance? Lily Rabe is playing the therapist, the family therapist over the course of this show.
Yeah,
everybody's
some
in
weird
therapy.
Ethics. Yeah, some weird ethics for this therapist. Although she does in the end say, too many of you, too many savages.
She just has like a rotate. They carpool. They get some family rate. They have like punch card. Like they get a free Sunday at the end of the week. Oh, and Rena Ranciv, I can't pronounce this name, from The Worst Person in the World, which I highly recommend. It's available on Hulu. This, not a romantic comedy, a dramedy about a young woman who is in this messy moment in life and the decisions she makes. And it just follows her life trajectory for a few years. Really just one of my favorite movies of the past few years. Highly recommend it. It's hard to give it a quick synopsis, but I mentioned it to you, Sona, earlier. You might want to check this out. It's not like the Before movies, but it has some of those vibes, catching up with someone over different periods of their lives and the decisions they make and the consequences of those decisions, and dipping in and seeing these alternate histories. It's excellent. An incredible soundtrack, by the way, too. So check that out if you haven't. Easily available on Hulu. Also another big award winner a couple of years ago, and highly recommended. Oh, and one more recommendation before we get into the breakdowns is this makes me think about something we discussed on the podcast not that long ago, which was Anatomy of a Fall. I keep saying The Fall. Anatomy of a Fall.
Legends of the Fall.
Maybe that's what I'm confusing it with.
Very different movie.
Very different, yes. It'd be funny if a mashup of those two things. Another examination of marriage and how much can you know about something in a very different context, but also around a court case. So I think that as the next 3 episodes play out, I think may be even more tightly coupled to some of the themes we talked about in that recap episode. And we have that in our feed, so check that out if you haven't. Or check out the movie for sure, which is also available on Hulu. So a compliment I want to make for episode 1, which I think is pretty stellar across the board. But one of the things that I found most interesting about it was this real weight of this discovery, Carolyn, whose body is found, bludgeoned to death, hogtied in this particular way, and that you feel the weight of every character in the show, especially in The Office, and it feels real. It feels like this is really something that is traumatized the whole entire group, which I think is oftentimes skirted over. You watch like a Law and Order, and then you cut to the interviewing of the suspects, and there's never really a weight to the consequences of the crime. And I really enjoyed that very much here in this early part of the show. And it's just so beautifully directed, this first episode of the show as well.
Can you imagine going to work and finding out that your coworker was murdered?
Exactly. Within the family, we find out over the course of this first episode that Barbara knew that Rusty was having an affair with the Carolyn character, but she wants him to, it's just a very interesting moment where she needs him to stop loving her, which I think is a really interesting moment there. And it's once again, Ruth Negga giving this, what could be a really convoluted performance, some real gravitas and believability, that she wants to be there for him, understands that he's going through this, but then of course she doesn't want to continue to compete with this woman even after she's dead, right?
And also what I really love about this, I shouldn't say I really love it, what I find really interesting about this affair storyline is this general quick acknowledgement that it wasn't just some physical thing or some bad judgment, that there was real emotion behind it, and that Rusty really at least believes that he was very much in love with this woman, which I think is a much more complicated route to take than the average midlife crisis type affair.
I agree with all that. Some other key points that are set up here is that there's this election that's looming with Nico and Tommy Molto, who are these really weaselly people inside this office working against the Bill Camp characters, who's currently the prosecutor. So there's this additional dynamic being added here. A couple things about Rusty. First of all, he used to be an athlete, so very type A personality. Obviously, this is something that I think is done well here over the course of the series in general. He's someone who's used to being in control. Maybe that is what makes him honestly look more and more suspicious as the show progresses. He might just be so unfamiliar with having lost any control over his own narrative or his own decisions.
Yeah, and I think used to not being questioned, right?
Yes.
Not having to
Absolutely.
explain yourself.
Yeah, he's a prosecutor, right? We see this in his interactions even with his children later on. He goes on the offensive and he's asking these questions. And in a way, the interrogation also allows him to change the subject and not point it back at himself. So someone who's so used to being on that side of the fence, basically. And it really plays out interestingly here. But we also see, of course, hypocritically, that he is being vociferous in the way he's attacking some of these potential suspects And simultaneously, we know he's hiding evidence that might implicate him or at least draw attention to himself. He's a very unlikable character.
I will say, in his defense,
yeah.
if he didn't do it,
right.
you understand that human instinct, right?
Of absolutely.
You didn't do it. So all this stuff that makes you look like you did it, you just need to get rid of it because you didn't do it.
Yes. A couple of key points here, too, is we see that he practices pitching all the time, and maybe that took a different trajectory. He's trying to impose that on his son. This is a dynamic you see very frequently. Also, that you see people who are in one stressful line of work, maybe excelling as an athlete, then go into another high stress job. As a matter of fact, one of my wife's coworkers is a doctor now, used to be a professional NHL player, and also in the same hospital, someone who used to be a professional football player is now a doctor as well. So it seems it's not uncommon, obviously, for someone who's used to practicing and studying, whether it's athletics and working within a team environment and pushing themselves all the time, then go into another high stress job. So I think that is true of this Rusty character. I had a question for you. I know you haven't worked in the prosecutor's office before, but you have these different lawyers who are colleagues and competing with each other. And of course, very type A. I assume this is a pretty common personality type that you've experienced in your line of work.
Yes, I think litigators do come in all shapes and sizes, but it definitely is a very specific type of that person who is doing all the things all the time.
And do you think that ties into the way that Rusty is dealing with this case? If you were going to psychoanalyze his behavior here, of course, you don't know whether there's going to be a twist here where he's the killer, potentially, who knows? But what do you think about him as far as his psychology in obviously having this affair, trying to cover it up, leading the investigation, knowing full well that he's going to be a suspect at some point? What do you think about the levels of denial he has to be into or of entitlement?
There's definitely some bias in my perspective because I am a brown woman litigator. And especially in the areas I have practiced in, that is not a common demographic. And I generally have worked with a lot of white male litigators, and I have found them to have largely certain traits in common, which do involve an outsized sense of self-confidence often. Trying to tread carefully here. There are certain people who have not really been told that they do much wrong, whether that's accurate or not. And they really adopt that into the way they deal with other people, the way they deal with their work. It just hasn't occurred to them that they haven't earned the confidence that they have. Here, it does seem that he is very good at his job, right? That's the impression that we're given. And I will say, criminal practice, where you're taking things to a verdict much more than in other areas of litigation, you do have a record that you can stand on of how many convictions you have or how many not guilty verdicts you have. Perhaps in his case, earned self-confidence. And maybe there's an argument to be made that you need to have that ego to do well. I've met my share of non-charismatic litigators where I think this is such a strange fit. These people maybe aren't in the courtroom that much, and neither am I, to be honest. Generally, if you are going to be in the courtroom a lot, you want somebody who's very charismatic. You want somebody who seems like they came from central casting when you asked for a litigator.
Right.
And Jake Gyllenhaal's character here checks all of those boxes, right? Someone that the jury is going to enjoy looking at, listening to, and that they want to believe. So I think he probably does have this hubris, and it probably in his case is more earned than for most litigators.
Right.
But yeah, then it's making it hard for him to step back and think, oh, the way I've looked at all those defendants across the table, that's me now. And somebody is looking at me that way. I don't think his head is able to wrap itself around that idea, right? He's so driven by this confidence in himself. And if he really didn't do it, this idea, I didn't do it. So what does it matter if I do any of these things because I didn't do it? So there's no way the justice system could be so flawed that it would somehow end up with a wrongful conviction. So none of this matters. What matters is figuring out who actually did it.
touching on a lot of things you just said. First of all, I think that there's something to be said about being an athlete or being a litigator where you have to have that mentality. Because obviously, if you've lost and you've lost and you've lost, or you have a case that looks like it's going to be a loser, you have to convince yourself that you're going to win this time, no matter what. So there's a certain amount of delusion. And maybe that is required for the role, right? The only way to win the case, basically, is to go in there and act like I can't possibly lose. Because even if you're just bluffing, then how does your bluff work if you walk in there admitting that you've already lost? Right? And the only way to convince everybody else of that is to convince yourself. And maybe that explains also some of the ridiculous decisions he makes along the way of covering things up that are obviously going to come to light. But maybe that is part of his mentality. A missed opportunity, I think, a little bit. There is this other character, this Hannibal Lecter-like character, at least introduced early on, who becomes a suspect in the next episode because of the fact that there was this murder case that he went to trial for, that this girl that was found in his home was hogtied in the same way that Carolyn's body is found. So that obviously is a connection between the two of them. Someone had to at least be aware of this case to have done this to Carolyn. And so, of course, that makes him a suspect, something that was teased earlier on and would be developed more so in maybe a better version of the show, or maybe a show that aligns more with my tastes. What if you have always been looking at that guy saying, he's obviously the bad guy, and no matter what I do to make him look worse is justified because, hey, he did it. And I have all the reason in the world to give him no quarter and treat him however I want to. He's the bad guy. And all of a sudden, that person who's so confident in that point of view has the tables turned on him. And that is potentially really interesting. And maybe we will see that play out now in the tail end of the show, because I think that is maybe psychologically the most interesting revelation here, right? Is for someone to actually have to acknowledge that they may have been wrong many times in the past.
Right.
And do you remember what the button is on the end of episode 1? Is there a button on it?
Oh,
or
gosh.
Cliffhanger of some kind?
It feels like a lifetime ago. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I know, exactly. Especially because I watched episode 1 and 2 together.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was about to say. I think it was, if I'm remembering right, it might be that Carolyn was pregnant.
Yes, that might be it. By the way, a lot of this stuff is different than it is in the book. And maybe I'll break that down later on when we get towards the end of the show. But so much of the show is really off book in so many ways. And that's one of them. That Carolyn is not pregnant in the book. I don't think she's also hogtied, which makes things much more complicated when you have this sexual aspect to the assault, potentially sexual aspect to the assault, because she's just bludgeoned to death, I think, in the book.
Right.
I have to double check that, which of course is the same here. But that adding that aspect to obviously connecting her to one of her previous cases is something that's not in the book as far as I remember. But maybe I'll do a side-by-side breakdown later on when the show wraps up. I don't have a huge amount of notes here for episode 2, but a couple of really key points. I think what's strong about episode 2 is it's not so plot-driven, which is what I thought maybe how the show would play out over time. A few key points. One is that Barbara tells Rusty that he has to tell the kids about the affair, that she doesn't want to go through this on her own again, which I think is a really strong scene, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And then another interesting point is I like when Rusty, once again, with this chip on his shoulder, goes back to the prison to talk to this other killer who is potentially a suspect if he had some kind of co-conspirator, because there were 2 sperm samples found in the girl from that previous crime. Apparently, the second sperm donor was hidden. So this is something that he was not aware of. So he's discovering over time that he didn't know Carolyn as well as he expected. And that happens more so as the things progress. And I liked
big prosecutorial misconduct, by the way, to not disclose that second DNA sample.
And this great character, once again, from Barry, this actor who plays the medical examiner, who assumes that Rusty knew about this, but this is, I mentioned this to you earlier. I find it very funny that this actor's always turned up to 11. Every performance I've seen him in, maybe he can give something a little more tuned down, but apparently they always ask him to crank it up as high as possible energy-wise. So.
I love this character. I think he's so funny.
Yeah, he was great. He's very funny in Barry too, by the way. And yet, when he goes to visit this guy in the prison and he starts confronting him with this killer smirks at him and says, "You're desperate," which is very telling, I think. You see how Rusty reacts to this also, that being called out on it, because he really did start to think, as in convincing yourself of something, that he's like, I'm really onto something. This is it. And then when the guy just smirks at him and goes, oh boy, you're in trouble, Rusty gets very concerned, I think, legitimately. And then the button on this episode is an obvious button. It's when he gets that text message saying, I know you were there.
Yes.
Something in episode 2 that didn't work very well for me was when Rusty says to his family, look, I'm a suspect now. I didn't set this up as context, but I should have. They've lost the election. Nico's won. Rusty legitimately was dragging his feet, going after these red herrings, obviously not pursuing the evidence because he was afraid it would implicate him in some way. He also made enemies. Tommy seems to hate him already. Nico seems to hate, and Nico doesn't seem to hate him. He seems to be purely a political figure. Tommy definitely hates him. He sees him as competition, I assume, within the organization, and maybe sexually as well. We'll find out over time. And then they lose the election. And within very short order, once they start doing their own investigation, Rusty becomes a prime suspect. And Rusty says they're going to arrest me because they're going to look at my phone and they're going to look at my computer and they're going to find out that I was obsessed with her. Again, another wound. We see it play out on Barbara's face, obviously, when this revelation that he was still seeing her. But my question to you, Sona, as far as the beginning of maybe not being the smartest person here, he has been investigating this case for, I assume, not a week, but months, because this whole election cycle has played out, and making very little progress. Of course, whether he did this or whether he's just afraid of implicating himself, shouldn't he be cleaning things up? Shouldn't he be getting rid of that computer? Shouldn't he be cleaning out his phone? Shouldn't he buy a new phone? And obviously, the text messages, some of that stuff, like the number of communications between them would be known. But the content of a lot of those, the explicitness and the photographs, etc., the GPS locations, that phone could have disappeared before he became a suspect, no?
Two things I want to say about that. One is, this is something interesting that they've done here because, as we talked about, the book and the movie take place over 20 years ago, right? So
yes.
It's
Very good point.
interesting that they've chosen to bring the modern era, the modern technology, smartphones, all of that into this, because in some ways it does allow for a lot more interesting plot lines. And then in other ways, it makes it a lot more complicated story when you have to deal with the existence of smartphones and text messages and GPS and all of that. So I thought it was an interesting decision. And as someone who was familiar with the prior book and movie, I like this because it's something different than what I've seen before. So I am enjoying that. Then to get to the substance of your question, are you saying he should have destroyed evidence?
I'm saying yes, unless maybe, and maybe I'm not giving him enough credit, maybe I'm thinking about him as more nefarious than he may be, because on the one hand, I'm saying, let's say he actually is the culprit. Wouldn't you want to make the case against you as hard as possible to make? But not only that, let's say that he is the type of person we were describing before who is so cocky and confident, thinking that if I didn't do this, then I'm never going to be implicated in it. But we know that he has intentionally been hiding evidence, or at least not pursuing evidence that does implicate him in some way, trying to build this alternate narrative. If he does legitimately believe that if he's that type of person, then wouldn't making these pieces of evidence disappear be in his own self-interest? Maybe your scenario where you're saying we should never do this because he's this person who believes in the system and thinks that, yeah, I can put everything on the table and no one would ever implicate me because I believe so thoroughly in the system. I think he's proven himself not to be that person at all up until this point. So I just think it's out of character for him to not dispose of his phone, basically.
You're making an interesting point. I think actually it is what you said, that he has this belief that he didn't do it, let's say, for the sake of this conversation. So it really doesn't matter what they find because he didn't do it. And how could this evidence possibly make people think he did it when he didn't? Right. I think he does have that confidence to think everything's going to be fine. And I think at the same time, it plays into like, yes, leading the investigation and focusing on other things because in his head, he didn't do it. So why would he waste his time and resources focusing on that stuff when he knows that it's going to lead nowhere. I do think they've shown that he has a pretty strong sense of ethics, because he does seem disturbed by the fact that Carolyn didn't disclose this other DNA sample.
Right.
I think there's a push-pull for him, of being completely upfront with everything and dealing with the repercussions of that, right? It's much easier if your wife doesn't know that you rekindled your affair, that you swore nothing had been happening for months, and you had essentially been stalking your affair partner. It's much easier for his life, especially given the other stuff that's going on, to not have that publicized. But also, the other part of the push-pull is, but so what? I still didn't do it, so it doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah, that's where I'm at too, where I'm questioning it to some extent, is just what you brought up, his conversations with his therapist, where that's just the two of them, and his conversations obviously with his wife, where he's telling her half-truths, that he was with this woman, but not anymore, not in a long time. But when actually it was ongoing, actually it was the night of the murder, right? So all those things obviously make him very suspicious, including his phone interactions the day of or leading up to the night of the murder. All of that makes me feel like he is not an honest broker. So how is he not going one step further? But maybe, to your point, maybe he does still have this piousness, and he thinks, if I go that extra step, then I am doing something wrong. But if I just get up to that step, it depends on where he's defining that line. I think it's just convenience. To your broader point, I think it also is a little bit of the show wanting to set things in contemporary times, but then shoehorning themselves into the reality of DNA evidence. And
it would support, as far as us trying to figure out who done it here.
Yeah.
What I'm saying would support that he is innocent, because a guilty person would start questioning all that stuff, right? Saying like, oh crap, this is all going to come to light, and there's going to be no way out of it. Theoretically, when you're doing the calculus of maybe who the culprit is, it supports that he is innocent.
Yeah. I honestly, even if they change things, I honestly think that he is innocent, because if the show is basically, he looks like he did it and he did it, there's not much of, for a movie that might work fine. You have somebody cravenly trying to point the finger at everybody else, and then in the end it's them after all. That might work, but we're in the middle of it. This is 8 episodes long. We get to the end and he's just like, yep, it was me. I'm like, oh, okay, what was the purpose of all this? Oh, spoiler, we can't say that. I might have to cut that up. We'll say the spoilers for another David Kelly drama that maybe the audience probably overlaps significantly here, so who knows.
Fair.
Might not be a spoiler for most listeners. Yeah, so then we lead into episode 3. The new red herring here is the sons. We have these bookends of suspects for this particular episode. One is the son. Importantly, by the way, he did not know that she had a son. Another suspect potentially is not only the son, but of course the estranged husband. The relationship she had, that she was so alienated from the family. Not only that she never came forward with this person she's having an affair with, maybe not the person you would tell you have a son, but that being coworkers and working intimately for so long that the son has never come up. That's very telling, I think, of her personality, Carolyn's personality, and also I think shakes Rusty to some extent, that he doesn't know her that well, doesn't know anybody that well. Maybe I think that is an important theme here in the show, is once again how we know people, but only on the surface level. And so much of that is what they're projecting to us and what we are projecting to ourselves about that person, and not understanding them truly. And of course, another thing that he did not know about Carolyn, the hiding of the evidence, one, but then of course, much more pressingly, I think, she had a child, a teenage child, and he worked with her for years and never knew this.
Yeah, that's insane.
And of course, this son is the person who texted him. He had been watching the apartment. He had evidence that he was there. This evidence has been shared already with the prosecutor's office. But then the culmination point, once they share this evidence with his defense team, and of course, he's brought in Bill Camp's character as his defense attorney. I'm not sure, given that he is partially the reason that he lost his election, that this psychology here works, that he would now come and defend Rusty. But in a way, I see him wanting to jab back at these people who took his job and were targeting him internally for this whole period of time. So I see that part of it. I'm not sure, and maybe we can talk about that for a minute. Do you think that his motivation is more to help out Rusty or to get some kind of revenge?
I think they make it clear that he does consider Rusty a good person and a friend, and that he doesn't think he did it. So I think it's all of the things you said. I think he believes he's doing the right thing. I think he believes he got screwed in this election, and he does want to show that he was the better choice. And I also think, as the point his wife makes, he's just not willing to call it a day on his career. And so this is the perfect opportunity to stay in the game. And that is driving something else in him.
Have you ever seen that type of dynamic inside of, obviously not a prosecutor's office, but this internal competition within a practice, or know of it? Is that something that you've been privy to in the past?
Well,
or is that commonplace, I should ask? Yeah.
In my area, there is a lot of vying for leadership roles in complex litigations that can be very cutthroat, but not in a way that presents the opportunity for someone to take the other side as a form of revenge.
Right. True.
Like we're all pretty committed to our side of the V, as we say. I suppose there's something going around interpersonally. You screwed me on this case, so I'll screw you on that case. Not in this stark way of going from prosecution to defense.
Given that you do like a lot of class action lawsuits, have you ever seen that where someone is an insider working for corporations, for example, and now flip it to the other side, or someone who was like a lobbyist, or vice versa?
I have seen people go from defense to plaintiff side. I haven't really seen people go from plaintiff side to defense side, although I'm sure it happens. And the people that I've seen go from the defense to plaintiff side, they generally have some sort of idea for some type of litigation that, should it come to fruition, they're not going to have to worry about money for the rest of their lives. And that's usually what drives them, is they have a specific thing that they want to do that they think is going to be very lucrative. And so it's really not, in my very limited experience with this, a decision driven by ethics or morals, but just of your own self-interest.
And just one more point on that, because this is different than the book. It's great because they get to keep Bill Camp in the show, obviously, but they bring in some hotshot lawyer, which then is like a big moment in the book and in the movie. I forget who the actor is who they play this, but it's like a very charismatic character comes in. And maybe that's an interesting dynamic that doesn't play out here in the book and the movie. Imagine you are the prosecutor and this is the defense attorney you hate the most. Suddenly he's the guy you need to protect you. By having Bill Camp switch over to the other side, that's interesting, but you don't see that tension where Rusty is side by side with theoretically his worst enemy a month ago, and now they are on the same side. So to wrap up episode 3, and before we move on to episode 4, of course, this theme of sons, which really I think should have been developed more, it gets short shrift, the neglected son, and then the revelation in the final moments here, which bleeds over into episode 4, that Rusty's son was there on a bicycle, and that basically brings up the very beginning of episode 4, where we see Rusty once again on his high horse becoming very prosecutorial. By the way, we see him do this with Carolyn's son in the previous episode also, where he starts asking, why were you there? How come you had this evidence? Why didn't you disclose it? Starts treating him immediately like he is a suspect, which does make me feel like the lady doth protest too much, that the fact that he's immediately antagonizing everybody who's a possible suspect makes him feel, to me, and maybe this is intentional to the audience, more guilty than potentially he is. He does the same thing to his own son. Absolutely. But he does this to everybody. Like, he really does go after everybody, like you are, whether he's visiting, I can't remember the character's name, in prison, or Carolyn's son. And then, of course, his own son, he goes right at him. And he's like, why were you there? What were you doing? And Barbara even calls him out on it, going, hey, chill out. Are you prosecuting our son right now? What is going on here?
Yes, but, and maybe this is my own bias, there is an argument that this kid is going to get asked these exact same questions in this exact same manner.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
He may as well get used to answering them and keeping it together, because it could very well happen.
But he should say that, first of all. And second of all, I find that he does this to every character in the series, to his own detriment, by the way, when he scares away a possible suspect rather than trying to get him to implicate himself. So yeah, it just seems to be more a pattern of his behavior. Episode 3, like I mentioned, was a little rough, but filling in blanks, etc., and throwing in red herrings to protract the plot. But episode 4, for me, I don't even remember exactly what happened beat for beat. There's one thing here I really don't like, which I'll bring up later. But the two things I loved in this episode, and the reason I liked it so much, was the opening sequence where Bill Camp is, I'm going to keep calling him by the actor's name rather than the character's name.
I get it, believe me.
That he is basically mocking Rusty's character, talking about, this is your opinion of marriage, and just that whole entire opening sequence where he is just going at him just made me laugh. He's so acerbic, so cruel to his assessment of Rusty's personality. I love that. Like, man, Rusty's a little high on his horse for this. And he just tears him apart. That whole segment is just excellent. And the other really important sequence here that made this a standout episode was the bar conversation between Nico and Tommy, where he's like, Tommy, what is going on with you right here? Like that whole thing where he's like saying, do you want to prosecute this case? And he's like, oh yeah, I'm going to kill him. I'm going to tear him apart. And Nico's like, this is the type of answer that makes me very concerned. This is the point of the fact that he is so blinded that he cannot see that limitation of himself. That whole sequence is just exceptional. All the acting is amazing. All these character dynamics are fascinating. I love those two standout scenes here. Something that I think is not so great in this episode, in episode 4, which continues through episode 5, is this potential flirtation / affair between Barbara and this bartender. What do you think about all that?
I am just not interested in this. Listen, this woman could do whatever the heck she wants. She has earned it. I don't care. But I'm not interested in watching it happen. It's detracting from the focus of this to me. Maybe if the timeline of this had been different, I don't know. Maybe if she started this affair earlier, that might have worked better for me. But right now, I'm like, this murder investigation is underway. I don't care where you're sleeping.
And more than that, it's that she even calls this out when she's talking to her therapist. And this is the very funny sequence too, with the whole family all in therapy at the same time, which also happens in this episode very entertainingly. But to your point, Barbara even seems aware of it early on, that she's like, I can't be seen with this guy. People are probably, and she's correct about this, people are watching her every move. It is all over the news. This guy, for all she knows, is going to leak all their text messages. She has no idea what the consequences of this is. And this is when she decides to have her affair. Like you mentioned, she has every right to have an affair, by the way. She's not having an affair with a lifelong friend that she has confided in, or someone that she may have cheated with on Rusty back when she knew about the affair in the first place, and now she rekindles something. Like this random dude, this is just, none of this makes any sense to me. And I think they want it to be romantic with this date they go on in episode 5. It's strange. What's more interesting, though, is that it does rekindle the sexual chemistry with her husband, which I think is an interesting psychological dilemma, right? That she is flirting with this one guy and then expressing it sexually with him, which I did think was an interesting twist on things. Them continuing to pursue the relationship, and she kisses him. It's only a kiss so far. Okay, maybe the show is smarter than I'm giving it credit for. But them continuing this relationship seems to be a really bad idea, given the scrutiny her family is probably under right now. And add that to the dynamic in the family right now. Imagine the kids find out about that. Terrific. That'll be in the news also. Just traumatize your daughter forever. They've also run down who the second potential sperm donor is. It's somebody who is trying to keep this visit to these prostitutes secret. This person ends up finding out where he lives, which I can understand this person being annoyed, by the way, that this guy who's accused of murder has shown up at my house. But he is banging on the door, terrifying Rusty's family. And then, of course, the show trying to put its thumb on the scale even more so that Rusty is an unreliable narrator here. He loses his cool and beats this guy very badly. At this point, do you start thinking, why doesn't Barbara get the hell out of that house? He seems to be in a dangerous situation right now.
She's made it very clear how committed she is to making this work for her family's sake, at least for the time being.
Right.
And I guess that is really the underlying driver here.
But at some point, even for the well-being of your family, isn't getting out of that situation actually the best thing for them? She is supporting her husband here above and beyond, right? At some point, she would think that there's people showing up at her house. The media is here. I'm actually surprised that the media is not stationed outside their house or putting microphones in their kids' faces. I actually think that would happen. It would be even more exaggerated than what they've shown here, to be honest. And if that pressure is on your family, at some point, aren't you like, we need to get away from this whole situation? And maybe that would be a good idea, right? To just take the kids somewhere and hole up in somewhere else and just homeschool them for a month or two until things cool off.
There's also the idea of you really do love this person and want to support them during a time that is very hard. You don't want to abandon them. And as far as possible suspects go, maybe there's some guilt driving it.
True. That's a good point, especially if she thinks that maybe someone else in the family might have been the culprit. The son obviously is currently a potential suspect here. And you're absolutely correct that in general, just for appearance's sake, obviously like the Clinton situation, Hillary might not have been happy when that whole investigation was going on, but abandoning someone at that point is making them look even worse. But if you want to make that analogy at the same time, Rusty has lied to her very recently about the actual circumstances of things. So that was episode 4, except for the beating sequence at the end, which I thought was a little much. That leads us all to the current episode 5. I should bring up the titles of these episodes because they are interesting. But I did feel a little bit like episode 5 was maybe the show leaning even more so into a direction that isn't exactly what I had hoped for. I do want to touch on the titles of these episodes, and I did want to bring it up, but I skipped past it. Some of these are pretty straightforward. Episode 1 is called Bases Loaded, which is an interesting title for the episode. Obviously, the baseball metaphor. But I'm not sure what bases loaded means in the context of it's usually a good thing if bases are loaded.
Depends what team you're on.
True. Good point. The second episode is The People versus Rosette Savage, Rusty's actual name. Episode 3 is called Discovery. And of course, that is when this additional evidence is presented. So that's pretty straightforward. Episode 4 called The Burden. So that's, of course, the burden of evidence. And now in episode 5, this one is called Pregame. And of course, this is the pregame because it's all leading up to the case and those closing moments where Tommy makes those opening statements. And maybe we'll start there because that is like such a great button on the episode and really enthuses me for the rest of the show in the way that I lost a little bit of my interest with it. Let's start there. Throughout episode 4 and now in episode 5, we had seen that Tommy had been the person at the office actually that Carolyn was afraid of. So he was maybe stalking her as well. He's obviously a suspect here as well, but he seemed to be getting more and more erratic. And it seemed like he maybe would be an Achilles heel here for the prosecution. And then he makes that opening statement and Rusty's just like, oh, shit. Because unlike that burden of proof expectation from the opening of the series, he seems to know, regardless of what he said at the beginning of the top of this whole season of show, that it is really what the jury decides emotionally, like you touched on earlier. And Tommy has that case in his pocket right now.
Yeah, it was an interesting setup, I thought, to play on the idea of this was somebody I knew and I worked with, and I can't divorce myself from that. I also think, and we didn't talk about this, there's this other piece of evidence that it's unclear what's going on with it, right? About Rusty's DNA being under her fingernails.
Under the fingernails, yes, exactly.
And
which was just discovered this episode, yep.
With Rusty saying, no, that's not possible. It didn't happen. But obviously there's a report saying it is, and it did. And the interaction between Tommy and the medical examiner where they're doing a dry run of the cross-examination, and the medical examiner says, in to me, a weird tone of voice, I'm going to get you that report. I'll get you that report, which I'm assuming is referencing the DNA report on the fingernails and makes me wonder if there's something shady going on with it. What did you think about that?
Yeah, all of this is really interesting how you read that. How did DNA evidence get under her nails? He seems to say that she never scratched him. That was not anything in their foreplay or anything in the past. So once again, he's lied to us. And maybe that's all of this complexity is that he's lied to us. He's lied to himself over the course of this show. So how much of this is incorrect? He doesn't seem to have, at least as far as we know, he doesn't have any kind of wounds on his body. If she did scratch him deeply, I think there would have been something earlier on. We see him swimming almost every single day. We would have seen a Band-Aid on his back or on his face or something, right? So it would be something questionable about it. So where did the DNA come from? If someone's planted this on her body, obviously it has to be someone very close to him to get his DNA on the body. Or like you mentioned, is there some manipulation of the medical examiner himself? There's a lot of questions here about that DNA evidence, and very important that you brought it up. By the way, once again, a hurdle that this series may be, if they can't square this circle perfectly, it's a self-inflicted wound. The book obviously set much earlier in time where evidence was very different. The evidence, and I'll just lay this out here because I don't think it's a spoiler of any significance in the book, that the only evidence that ties Rusty to the crime scene is a fingerprint on a piece of evidence. I think it's a glass. And that piece of evidence disappears during the prosecution. And this whole thing ends up being a problem for the prosecutor's office because everything else is basically hearsay. There is no GPS coordinates on your cell phone proving that he was stalking her. And there is no DNA. There is no child that's forthcoming to prove that Rusty is the culprit potentially. So many things make Rusty look so guilty here in the TV show, which we are pretty certain is not going to be the case. But it does seem like the show has really railroaded him to an extent, and now they're going to have to undo all this as part of the investigation. It seems like they've done too much in a way. I mean, DNA under the fingernails is an extreme example of that, right?
I'm not sure how that is all going to play out. But yes, and they've also set up that like maybe he's blocked something out because he was at the bar before he went to her house and he was drinking and it's all a blur. So there's also that going on, that maybe he did something and he doesn't remember it.
Yes. I was going to say that's maybe the stylistic thing that I dislike the most in the show is that every episode practically opens with some vision that someone's having or a dream sequence that someone's having. That doesn't seem to make sense. Like we have a dream sequence that the Bill Camp character, once again, I'm going to call him by the actor's name, has where he sees Rusty committing the crime, but then how could he have seen him see the crime? In your dreams, you can't not be in your own POV. So is he there somehow in that vision of his dream? So does that make him an unreliable narrator? And like you said, even Rusty now starts having these dreams where he's committed the crime, which is believable. Obviously, people have these kind of stress nightmares where they see themselves in circumstances they're not in. But does it make him completely unreliable? Does he start doubting himself? Or maybe did he actually do the crime and then block it out somehow? The trauma has blocked it out of his own memory. But the worst thing that this episode does is the whole sequence, Bill Camp, once again, this whole scanner's head exploding at the beginning of the episode. What was up with that? That was where I was just like, okay, did we need this? This is crazy.
No, agree. We did not need it.
By the way, I'm a big David Cronenberg fan. I love that. It has become a meme, by the way, of the head exploding from the movie Scanners. Most people know the meme and don't know the movie. And this is basically a recreation of that sequence. But this must have taken some amount of time for someone to sit down and stage this head exploding sequence for a 2-second button. What is the purpose of that? I really felt like, what is this show doing putting this scene in here? It's so silly. And the fact that it's well executed makes me more suspicious of the purposes here. They probably spent a day doing this sequence. I'm not sure. In this show, this is what I would be spending my days shooting, just to be clear. But we do open almost every episode on Bill Camp's dream sequences. So I do wonder what that might mean for the future as well. Does he become a suspect? I would be curious to know if maybe.
I didn't see that coming, but I agree with you. This whole dream sequence thing generally is not working for me, and this one specifically did not work for me.
Oof, I agree completely.
So I am looking forward to this trial starting, seeing how things play out. I am very intrigued by the fact that no one has seen the last episode and what that means for whether it's going to stay true to the book and the movie, or they're going to take one of these other storylines that they've opened up and explore that further. I hope to see more of the medical examiner because I just love him so much. And yeah, like I am looking forward to the rest of this, although I'm not sure if 3 episodes is going to be 1 episode too many.
Possibly. Yeah, I guess it depends on how they structure it. I think if they resolve the plot in episode 7 and then there's the fallout of that in episode 8, I always want to see that, by the way, especially for shows that are one and dones. But I feel like that never ends up happening. They always end up leaving everything to get people hooked for that final episode. Everything resolves in the final moments of the final episode. And I don't like that because there's so many tantalizing follow-up questions I have once a story resolves, and to not have that additional segment, at least to resolve things maybe at the very beginning of episode 8. I can imagine the case looking worse and worse and more revelations coming out during the trial, and then potentially some of these characters having to go on be cross-examined. And then I assume some other shoe will drop. Some additional piece of evidence is going to exonerate Rusty. I believe that would be the case, unless he did it and then he just gets prosecuted and found guilty, and that's the end of the film, of the show. Given that the original story had a particular twist at the end that everybody remembers, this is going to have a memorable twist. Even if it's the same one, it needs to have some additional elements to it. And given the evidence here, it would have to have some additional twist to it. So
I agree.
We'll see how that goes. Okay, as far as the show goes, a few show notes. One is we will regroup at some point in the future to discuss the finale, probably the week of the finale, which is in 3 weeks. And we probably will not discuss this until then, my guess, unless we discuss it in conjunction with other things. But I'll tease out some of that as well. So we expect to have that conversation in about 3 weeks. Oh, next week, staying with Apple TV. Curious. I don't know if I'm going to follow this show throughout, but I am curious to check it out. And Sona, feel free to join in for this or not. It's up to you. There's a new series beginning on Apple TV Plus called Sunny, which is based on a novel that I just started reading. The description. Have you seen the trailer for this?
Yes, before the Presumed Innocent episode, actually, they showed it.
I have not seen the trailer for the show. That it has not been fed up to me as on the Presumed Innocent episodes, interestingly, but I did read a description of it. I started reading the novel, and part of the reason I'm so curious to check this out is almost everything on Apple TV Plus, by the way, is a novel adaptation. I started reading the novel as homework for whether I wanted to check out the show or not. And what I find so interesting about it is the show, and tell me if this is how the trailer presents it as well, is described as a thriller with comedic elements about this wife, Rashida Jones, who has lost her husband, potentially believes that she's lost her husband. He's left behind this helpful robot at the house. She hates the robot, and comedy ensues as she starts this relationship with this robot and starts to unravel potentially the mystery of her husband and son's disappearance. Is that more or less what they're presenting?
Yes.
The reason I mention that is because I started reading this book, and this book is very dark. It's not comedic. So I'm interested to see the adaptation of this in a very different tone, potentially. Maybe the book becomes more comedic over time, but it definitely does not present itself that way early on. It's also very esoteric. The book itself is pretty dense, and it's very much inside of her head as she's experiencing these emotional states. And it has some very strange science fiction elements. A lot of this might just be in her head, to be honest. Might just be the way she's perceiving the world, given her trauma. So it seems like it's going to probably be a very loose adaptation of the book, or maybe not. So anyway, all this makes me interested, at least to check out the premiere. So I will be checking it out and giving my initial opinions of it next week. It premieres next Wednesday. And Sona, feel free to jump into that conversation if you'd like. I don't know how interested you are in the show in general.
I'm not sure because that sci-fi element for
Right,
me is
right.
a little off-putting.
I do want to see a show that has an intelligent exploration of these AI themes, which are going to be not even science fiction in the next 5 or 6 years, to be honest. So we will be made to see how intelligently it deals with this topic. Oh, and then, of course, the thing that I think we definitely will be covering, Sona, you and I, is the new Natalie Portman series called Lady of the Lake. Is that what it's called?
I'm not sure.
Lady in the Lake, which is based on this award-winning novel. And some critics have seen some of the early episodes and are raving about it. So I am very curious to see this thriller, murder mystery that takes place in a very particular time during this racial tensions in New York. I believe it's New York in the 1960s. And parallel storylines, this white woman who's involved in this mystery that involves this Black woman as well, and the intersections of these two cultural things. And maybe we'll even talk about Full Circle yet again in more detail as in conjunction with that show. And that's premiering on the 17th. So I think that one is probably something that we will probably come back to multiple times over the course of its run, but we can check that out. And of course, on the 24th, the very next week, the finale of Presumed Innocent, which we'll definitely be covering here on the show. So that's the next 3 weeks. And in between there, movie reviews and other conversations I'll be having. There's a lot of stuff coming out in theaters. This is obviously the peak of movie-going season, and I'll have a lot of movies that are coming out, my usual list of recommendations. I'll put them all into lists on Letterboxd. I see a lot of people, our listeners, are following me on Letterboxd, so thanks for following me.
Nice.
And yeah, if anybody is in the past, people have asked like, where's that list of recommendations, etc. I try to put a list together when I make a list of recommendations, including reviews on Letterboxd. So follow me there. I also just review things I watch that I never talk about here on the show. So if you're curious about that, check out my Letterboxd. You do not have to be a Letterboxd member to follow me there. So if you're curious, check that out. And it's in the show notes. Okay, Sona, speaking of recommendations, I had a recommendation for you. Donald Sutherland just passed away, of course, just a week ago.
Yes.
And I have been rewatching some of his films. Invasion of the Body Snatchers is one that I watched, a 70s classic, which didn't hold up as well, although it has some very interesting parts to it. But a film that I had seen, tell me if you've ever watched it. This movie is 50 years old, and I think you will love this movie. My sister, by the way, I made her watch it. She had never seen it, and she loved it. I saw this movie when I was a teenager because it was one of those films that got discussed. It won Academy Awards. And my impression of it was, I don't know if that really was good. Why does everybody talk about that movie? And now seeing it as an adult, it is so great. The movie is called Klute. Have you ever seen this? Klute.
I've heard of it, but I don't know anything about it.
It's so beautifully photographed. It looks like you're looking at a magazine cover. So stylish. I think you would love it. And by the way, this is an erotic thriller before erotic thrillers existed. It's like really the origin to a large extent of the contemporary thriller. Directed by Alan J. Pakula in 1971. Of course, the director of The Pelican Brief and Presumed Innocent, the movie version of it. So he made many of these thrillers over the course of his career. He also won an Academy Award for doing All the President's Men, of course, a classic movie from the 70s. But I think that this movie feels so contemporary in its exploration of women having sexual autonomy and the way that it literally causes men to lose their minds. It's really about the sexual revolution thematically, even though it really is a murder mystery. At some points, it feels like a slasher film. There are scenes where there's not actually a slasher in this, but she's being observed, people watching her through these like layers through the windows of other buildings from a distance. So it's this really, like, it really has the language of those films of the 1970s, the surveillance genre of films, has these elements of an erotic thriller, has an incredible performance, absolutely incredible performance by Jane Fonda. So really surprising, and you should check it out. I think if you like psychological dramas, this is a very interesting one, and it has a mystery in it too. So psychological, it's really almost like a time capsule documentary. It even feels at some points very documentary-like as they go on this exploration and the layers of the culture that they're exploring, following one clue to the next location, to the next location. It almost feels like it is an excuse to document this subculture in New York and simultaneously has this thriller aspect, has this romance aspect to it. It's really almost perfect. It's called Klute, Klute, and you can find it almost everywhere. I think it's on HBO Max, it's on Tubi, on a lot of these free streaming services with ads, unfortunately. But yeah, very easy to catch up with. And yeah, surprisingly to me, a film that I didn't get it when I was young. I don't think it's a movie you're supposed to see when you're 17 years old.
Right.
Now seeing it as I was like, wow, this thing is so far ahead of its time. But yeah, it was a very interesting watch for me. Yeah, and that's my recommendation for the week. And so check that out. Even though it's an old movie, I think you will actually enjoy it.
Great.
All right. Enjoy your holiday, and I'll talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Take care.